Good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I put up the Dublin Civic Trust cover of their brochure for my first slide this afternoon because I was so taken with the beauty of this image, and I thought it was so clever, the brochure in general, in terms of it gave the sense of the wonderful context of Dublin and its remarkable setting to Dublin Bay. And I just want to say that I'm very privileged to be here today with such a great lineup of speakers, and I'm very grateful to Dublin Civic Trust for the care in which they have put this day together. It's, I think, a really important time for the Georgian city. And I also want to say that I think it's just true to Geraldine and Graham's attention to detail that we've come to another wonderful venue. We were brought to the House of Lords the last time for the Dutch Billies, and today we're in the Pillar Room, which is just quite remarkable. And I think you can't underestimate, by bringing people to a place and seeing how it works and experiencing it, that they start to think about it in a much different way. So, moving on. I suppose the context that they show in the front of the brochure is really, so well described in terms of, how Dublin worked with its topography, how clever the White Street Commissioners were in terms of their visionary thinking. Merlo explained how, the early medieval streets were overlaid with the Georgian plans. And as a sort of a precursor to today's event, we had 2 walking tours with Dublin City Council officials looking at Dublin with John Montague and with Dr. Conor Lucy. And John made, I was on John's tour, and he just made a very simple point to me, the importance of the river in the 18th century, and the fact that the control of the bridge, that the merchants of the city resisted development to the east, and really the Georgian north and south city really weren't connected until quite late in their overall development, and which is seen in the map on the right-hand side. And that's just, that link between north and south, I suppose, is something that I want to just raise today as one of the challenges, and how we might go about assisting it, the reconnection, and I suppose maybe explore a little bit about why we don't have that strong vision in our mind. And I want to say that there's a lot of people who helped me put this paper today in terms of the amount of work that they have produced in recent times. And we've been very fortunate in City Architects to have the benefit of UCT students to internships. This is an image that they created for us, and it sort of reinforces the idea of the bay and this unique setting. And I don't know how many of you realise that is what the image that you have on your £10 note in your wallet. It's a very particular one. Sorry about the slide quality, but this is Jacinta Prunty's work on the tenements in Dublin, and this is a map that was generated that showed our first-class streets and our first-class retail areas. And this legacy of tenancy and the dereliction that are brought to Dublin is one that I think we still have today, that we haven't really quite understood how to deal with. And I think Merlo's images of the blockages and barriers, certainly we must be encouraged to go back and look at some of these things. This is a map of the civil survey done by the city architect Horace O'Rourke, and I think it's very important that the resources of mapping and research in terms of economic downturn and economic need can't be overestimated. The map is probably not as clear enough as it could be because of the reproduction, but it does show the blight that was present at the time of this survey in the north and the west of the city. And when I go on to the wonderful image from Paul Kearns and Motti Rummy's Redrawing Dublin book, it's almost like a negative, a positive and negative, because the negative is still very much present today. And when we talk about the Georgian city, we see the south side as the positive or the Georgian city, which is something quite extraordinary, really, that we've forgotten the northern archipelago. And that, to me, is the big challenge that we have to try and address. My special interest in Dublin was primarily Marion Square, and I have Loughlin Keeley and that to thank for keeping me focused and pushing on through it. And I was very fortunate with a number of other city architects to produce our work, our primary research, in a book on the Georgian squares of Dublin, an idea brought about by Susan Roundtree, a colleague of mine. And I suppose that really started us thinking in a new way in terms of looking at collections of buildings and squares and streetscapes. And Dublin Civic Trust, ever to the minute and to the point, produced a wonderful document about the historic city and showing its framing and its squares and how, our Georgian squares are structured to our city. And that very much was picked up and re-echoed again in terms of the public realm strategy produced by Dublin City Council, which gives us a framework in which to act and to think about the city context. I also want to say that I think from the time we had our change of legislation from 2000, that I think there's been an extraordinary, it's been a golden period of research on Dublin, and there's an incredible amount of data and information and research on the city, which now, in terms of understanding its context, is there for us to actually harness and to use. This is Georgian Dublin, as many people come to Dublin, see, and wonder what on earth this is all about. And as Christina Casey says, a cornice is an event. And it's this hypnotic way that Dublin is that really, it doesn't help people get why it's so important. And as part of the talk this afternoon, I just took the images from my Dublin Squares book, which we produced with Mary Clark in the City Archives, and Alistair Smeaton took these photographs. And the first image is some of the architectural and decorative detailing of Marion Square houses. The second one is Fitzwilliam Square houses. The next one is Parnell Square houses, and the one on the right is Mountjoy Square. And if we start to tell the story of Georgian Dublin and the squares and their legacy, you can see the level of richness and beauty and significance that is embodied in these buildings. And somehow we have to unlock that for people to be part of and to ensure the future of the buildings and their surroundings. I just want to talk about the legislation and regulatory framework which I operate. I became a conservation officer in 2000, and we had an RPS. We inherited a record of protected structures of 9,000 buildings. And the 9,000 buildings were put together at various different times by various different stakeholders submitting recommendations to the City Council, and that's what we took on then as our heritage stock for the city. Because of various reasons, and there were good ones, the interim survey for Dublin never took place. And I've only recently started to look at the interim survey for Dublin. And we started, I think, quite strategically on the north side of the city in Dublin 1. And I just want to say that the inventory is a very important part of our appreciation of the city. And it's important that it continues, because the problem we have is that people don't understand the city and don't know how to value it or how to interact with it. And I would see the inventory as being one of the critical stages that we actually have to start to put in place. The other reason why it's important is that it establishes the building context for the city. And the research that we have, as I say, had benefit of in recent years, can hang on this database and can be kept live and dynamic for people to make informed decisions. So, you know, if I'm going to appeal for anything, I would put it out there that the inventory is an important part of trying to understand and work in the city. Another thing I was very fortunate to be involved with was the Pivot Dublin experience. And even though Dublin was runner-up for this award of Design Capital Award, the process was a fantastic thing to witness and to, as I say, to be part of. And for me, one of the very important things that came out of it was the idea that historic Dublin is this incredible context in which we can design and which we can look at having sustainable city to live in. The other part of it was the fact that a very disparate kind of design community was brought together with a common goal and actually learnt about themselves and learned how to establish a network or a base from which they all could operate. And where we're in an economic climate of dwindling resources, difficult funding, it can be very challenging. But I think what was remarkable about the Pivot Dublin experience was that rather than one person being overwhelmed with the task, there was suddenly a community who actually was able to deliver an incredible joined-up thinking approach to design in the city, and that has left a legacy. And I think if there's anything to be learned from it, it is that approach that the heritage community in Dublin has to take, and actually the collaboration and establishing a network that works with one another. I think there's signs of that happening now, but I think it has to be encouraged more. I've had a fascinating morning, brilliant morning, listening to people's papers. And I suppose where we inherited the record of protected structures, we started working on them very much as individual buildings. And now I think the conversation is very much, as I say, moved to an urban landscape, a collection of streetscapes and squares. Charles Duggan is doing wonderful work about trying to establish the White Street Commissioner's influence in the city, first European planners. I mean, I was just so struck by, you know, why do we have these extraordinary collection of squares, and why aren't we able to sort of tell the story of them and integrate the story of these squares so that people, you know, when they come to Dublin, they don't get emptied out of a bus on Fitzwilliam Square and look at one door and think that they've done Georgian Dublin. I think that's, you know, something that we can really help with. The image on the left is actually from a publication by the Rotunda itself, and it shows a very charming image of this unique square. I think James gave a very exciting historical background to it, and I'm always just amazed at how fantastically interesting it is in terms of its terraces and the buildings that are around it. And I think the Dublin Civic Trust are doing their fourth open garden day this weekend. And I think it's an incredible initiative in terms of actually bringing people to Dublin and looking at the squares and participating in the squares. And I'm very sure that you're not just looking at the gardens, but you're actually enjoying the architectural buildings around them. And I suppose I'm conscious that, you know, we have to make buildings more accessible. Another really great idea that took place with Fulch Ireland was an innovation idea of Mary King's and Gráinne Miller from Temple Bar, and it was Marion Square Innovation. And I think it's left an incredible legacy of a network within the square where there is a constant impetus to produce open-door events for the square. I have a 7-year-old son, and he wanted to know where we're going to be doing Cultural Night again on Marion Square. And, you know, the idea of so many doors being open as part of this programme meant that we were able to visit so many buildings and enjoy them and meet people and interact with people. And today, you know, I was very disappointed this summer when I had to lead a party of delegates on a trip around Georgia and Dublin, and the Architectural Archive were closed, and you know there were good reasons for that. But I suppose it's a very important building in terms of actually being able to bring people to Dublin and explain about the square, overlook it, and the buildings that are around it, and we have to have more of that. I'm just going to move on to some of the challenges that we face in terms of having people live around the square. And this wonderful image by Paul Kearns and Matti Rumi in the book on Rejoin Dublin is, I think, very particular. And I think, you know, why don't we get that you might actually have the prestigious you know, opportunity of living in the presence of Gandon's architecture immediately in historic Dublin. And what are the reasons that maybe this isn't happening? You know, we have poor management policies of our streetscapes. We don't necessarily organise our transport or parking in the city very well. We've turned a blind eye on our laneways, and we are willing to put up with vacancy and redundancy without actually, you know, look for new uses. Image on the bottom right is Richard Castle's last mansion house to Con Street. It is the most superb building in terms of early Georgian, and while it's mothballed very carefully, it just sits there, and it should be actually contributing to the city life. We have other issues. We have planning regulatory framework, which people will find problematic, but it becomes even more complicated when you add in things like universal access, thermal upgrading, and you know, best practice in terms of conservation, where you may have different materials. I think we could actually help people a lot more with better guidance on how we actually might go about it, and we need to give sort of more coherent direction in terms of managed solutions for historic buildings. That would certainly help them. This is a project that we did in City Architects. It looked at Georgian fabric in the Lower Mines Road. It looked at multiple tenancy and how you might reuse buildings. When does multi-tenancy become problematic to historic buildings? But we need more of this. I was fortunate enough to attend a conference in Berlin. I went with some colleagues, and I was very encouraged that Europe, in its thinking about historic cities, is putting conservation as a main theme for urban regeneration, a theme along with transportation and sustainability. And I suppose I often get told that I'm looking through a narrow lens in terms of, you know, being focused on, say, historical fabric. But really, conservation and its message, I think, on a European level, is looking at sustainable cities and looking at historic cities as being the answer to a lot of our eco issues and our best use of resources. Okay. This image kind of tells you the challenges that we face in Dublin. Streetscape clutter, the undervaluing of the sites, the traffic issues. There are solutions and models to follow. This was the Bologna project, which is historic at this stage, but it changed a cityscape where they looked at its city, its building typologies, its spaces, mapped them, and started to talk about how they were going to remake the city with well-designed buildings. This is the Vienna model, where they show buildings that are to be well protected in red, buildings that have been replaced that maybe can be replaced again in yellow, for instance. And I suppose what I'm saying is that if we could move from just zoning mapping to actual more three-dimensional planning, we would start to answer some of the issues of the Georgian core. Your typical Georgian square and the issues of the rear sites. And as I say, a strong focus from the Pivot Dublin experience was the idea of high-quality design for Georgian buildings. And I think this is Buckingham Street and how a street has been remade. I'm just there, and just really couldn't finish without mentioning the culture quarter in Parnell Square, so Ali will forgive me if I take a minute more. I think this is a really important initiative of the city architect, and I think it's a real chance for us to trial some of these things that Europe have done and how they have worked with the city, and how we can anchor these the regeneration and the remaking of the Georgian city off a project like this is very important. Charles Duggan very kindly gave me his map, which shows the fragmentation of the North Georgian core. The brown is what's left. And I suppose if there's ever an imperative, the national inventory and policies that actually start to remake the city really now have to be considered. You can't see it in this, so I won't delay on it. But this is an ironwork project that we've been doing currently in City Architects with Carl Rappel. And it's starting to map the craftsmanship of the squares and what's important and what's special. And I suppose, to sum up, this is a long road. We're on it. It's going to be bouncy. Not sure when we're going to arrive, but I'm very sure that along the way there'll be a lot of people who will help and will make the journey enjoyable and exciting. Thank you.